So there I was, standing in front of the most prestigious educational institution in the known galaxy, wondering how the hell I'd ended up here. The Galactic Academy for Advanced Minds. Yeah, that's what they called it. Real subtle, right? Like they couldn't just call it Smart Kid University and save everyone the pretentious headache. The building itself looked like someone had taken a crystal cathedral, fed it steroids, and then asked a committee of aliens with no sense of architectural restraint to jazz it up a little. Floating spires twisted into impossible geometries, defying at least 3 laws of physics I could name and probably 17 I couldn't. Students floated past on anti-grav platforms, their various appendages buried in holographic textbooks that hurt to look at directly. And then there was me, Jake Martinez, human, former kindergarten teacher from Toledo, Ohio, current, well, that was still being figured out. See, apparently when humanity joined the Galactic Federation, they decided to send one representative to this fancy academy as part of some cultural exchange program. The application process was supposed to be incredibly rigorous, testing the absolute peak of human intellectual achievement. Somehow, my name got picked out of a hat. Literally, there was a hat involved. Earth's bureaucracy at its finest. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, surrounded by beings who could calculate the trajectory of 17 different moons while composing poetry in languages that didn't technically exist yet, and my biggest accomplishment was getting 26 5-year-olds to sit still long enough to learn the alphabet. I walked through the main entrance, past a group of what looked like sentient geometric shapes having an animated discussion about quantum mechanics. One of them was actually crying. Geometric tears. I didn't even know that was possible. The orientation packet had warned me about culture shock, but they'd undersold it. Way undersold it. The lobby alone was the size of a football stadium, filled with students from species I couldn't even pronounce. There was a blob of sentient jelly taking notes with what appeared to be its own pseudopods. A crystalline being was literally vibrating at frequencies that made my teeth ache. And in the corner, a group of 6-armed creatures were engaged in what I could only describe as competitive calculus. But the real showstopper was standing at the front of the orientation group. Professor Vextool, 8 feet of nightmare fuel wrapped in academic robes. Picture a praying mantis, right? Now picture that praying mantis hit the gym for about 50 years, developed an ego the size of Jupiter, and decided to become a college professor. That was Vextool. His species, the Zethari, were known throughout the galaxy for 2 things, being absolutely brilliant and being complete jerks about it. He had 4 arms, each one gesticulating dramatically as he spoke, in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a classical education. His triangular head swiveled on a neck that shouldn't have been able to support it, and his compound eyes seemed to take in everything at once, while simultaneously expressing deep disappointment in all of it. Welcome, inferior minds, to an institution that will either elevate your consciousness to previously unimaginable heights or crush your feeble intellects beneath the weight of true knowledge, he announced to the gathered crowd. I am Professor Vextool, and I will be conducting your mental resilience assessment. Mental resilience assessment. That sounded ominous. The student next to me, a nervous-looking creature with 3 eyes and what appeared to be anxiety sweats, whispered, "That's the guy who made the Crown Prince of Altair cry just by asking him to define the color blue." Great, just great. I looked around at my fellow students. Geniuses, every last one of them. Child prodigies, who'd mastered faster-than-light mathematics before they could walk. Beings whose IQs were measured in scientific notation. And me, a guy whose greatest intellectual achievement was figuring out that if you put the craft supplies on the high shelf, the kids can't eat them. Professor Vextool's gaze swept over the crowd like a predator selecting his next meal. When those compound eyes landed on me, I swear I felt my GPA drop just from the contact. "Ah," he said, his voice carrying the kind of disdain usually reserved for expired milk. "The human. How quaint." Quaint. Right, this was going to be fun. "Today," Professor Vextool continued, his voice carrying across the orientation hall like a death sentence with tenure, "we will be conducting my legendary mental dominance trial." The reaction was immediate. The 3-eyed anxious creature next to me actually whimpered. A crystalline being in the back row started vibrating at what I assumed was the frequency of pure terror. Even the sentient jelly looked like it was trying to ooze its way toward the exit. "Oh, come on," I muttered under my breath. "How bad could it be?" Apparently, I'd muttered louder than I thought, because Professor Vextool's head snapped toward me with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. "Excuse me, human. Did you have something to contribute to the discussion?" Every eye, compound and otherwise, turned to stare at me. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a plasma torch. I felt like a goldfish that had accidentally wandered into a shark tank and then decided to critique the decor. "Oh, no sir," I said, trying to shrink into invisibility. "Just wondering what the trial involves." Vexthul's mandibles clicked together in what I really hoped was amusement and not hunger. How refreshing. A mind so simple it doesn't even comprehend the magnitude of its own ignorance. Ouch. I'd been insulted by 5-year-olds with more creativity than that. "The mental dominance trial," he announced, beginning to pace back and forth like a predator sizing up prey, "is a psychological warfare exercise designed to test the absolute limits of your intellectual resilience. I will employ advanced techniques of mental manipulation, philosophical paradoxes that have driven lesser minds to madness, and cognitive challenges that exist in dimensions your primitive brains can barely perceive." The three-eyed student next to me was now quietly hyperventilating. One of the 6 armed math competitors had actually fainted, which was impressive considering they didn't appear to have blood. "The rules are simple," Vexthul continued. "One volunteer will face me in intellectual combat. They will be subjected to the full force of my mental prowess until they either demonstrate true resilience or are reduced to a gibbering mess of shattered consciousness. Who among you believes themselves capable of surviving such an ordeal?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, and probably everyone else's heartbeat, and maybe some heartbeats from the next solar system. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The crystalline being had stopped vibrating entirely, which seemed like the mineral equivalent of playing dead. "Nobody?" Vexthul asked, his voice dripping with disappointed superiority. "Truly, this generation of students is even more pathetic than I anticipated." And that's when I did something that, in retrospect, probably qualified as the stupidest thing I'd ever done in my life. And remember, I once tried to explain to a classroom of kindergartners why they couldn't keep the classroom hamster in their backpacks. I raised my hand. The reaction was immediate and apocalyptic. The 3-armed creature actually fell off his chair. Several students made what I assumed were prayers in languages I didn't recognize. The sentient jelly looked like it was having an existential crisis. Professor Vexthul's compound eyes focused on me with laser-like intensity. "The human volunteers?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and what sounded like genuine delight. "How absolutely delicious." "Yeah, sure," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I mean, how hard can it be?" The nervous laughter that rippled through the crowd sounded like the last gasps of dying civilizations. Vexthul's mandibles clicked rapidly now, definitely in amusement. "Oh my dear, simple little mammal. You have no idea what you've just volunteered for." Actually, he was probably right about that. 5 minutes later, I found myself sitting across from Professor Vexthul in what could only be described as an intellectual thunderdome. The other students had formed a circle around us at what they probably considered a safe distance, though I suspected if this went badly there wasn't a safe distance this side of the Andromeda Galaxy. The professor had dimmed the lights and activated some kind of holographic display that made the air shimmer with equations I couldn't even begin to pronounce, let alone solve. His 4 arms moved in hypnotic patterns as he prepared for what I assumed was going to be the mental equivalent of a nuclear strike. "Let us begin with something simple," he said, his voice taking on an ominous tone that suggested his definition of simple and mine were probably in different universes. "Tell me, human, if consciousness is merely an emergent property of sufficiently complex neural networks, and free will is an illusion created by deterministic processes we're too limited to perceive, then what meaning can existence possibly have in a universe where entropy guarantees that all achievements, all love, all hope will eventually decay into heat, death, and nothingness?" The crowd went silent. I could practically hear their brains trying to process the philosophical nuclear bomb that had just been dropped. I blinked a couple of times, scratched my head, and said, "Well, I mean, that's kind of a bummer way to look at it, isn't it?" Professor Vexthul's compound eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "I mean, sure, maybe we're all just chemical reactions pretending to be people, and maybe the universe is going to end badly, but like, we're here now, right? Might as well enjoy the ride." I tell my kids the same thing when they worry about growing up. You can't control tomorrow, but you can control whether you share your juice box today. The silence that followed was deafening. I was pretty sure I'd just committed some kind of philosophical war crime. Vexthul's mandibles clicked rapidly. "That is, not an adequate response to existential nihilism." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely curious. I mean, you asked what meaning existence can have, and I told you, the meaning is whatever we decide to make it. Like, right now, I'm getting meaning out of having this conversation with you. It's kind of fun. One of the 6 armed students whispered something that sounded like a prayer for my soul. The professor's eyes narrowed. Very well. Let us escalate. Behold! He gestured dramatically, and the holographic display exploded into a 3-dimensional maze of light that hurt to look at directly. This is a quantum logic puzzle existing in 11 dimensions simultaneously. The solution requires understanding mathematical concepts that your species won't develop for another 1,000 years. Solve it. I stared at the spinning, impossible geometry for a moment. It was like trying to look at a kaleidoscope having an argument with a migraine. Okay, I said, but can I ask a question first? Why do I need to solve it? Bexthul's head tilted at an angle that suggested his neck had more joints than should be legally allowed. Because it is a test of intellectual superiority. Right, but what happens if I solve it? Do I get a cookie? Does it fix world hunger? Does it make anyone happier? That is not the point. The point is the intellectual challenge itself. I nodded thoughtfully. So it's like a crossword puzzle, but with more pretension. The 3-eyed student made a noise that sounded like air being let out of a very sad balloon. It is not like a crossword puzzle. Vextul's voice cracked slightly. It is a test of mental acuity that has broken the minds of beings far superior to you. Okay, but hear me out, I said, leaning forward conspiratorially. What if instead of breaking people's minds, we just, didn't? What if we made puzzles that were fun instead of traumatic? Revolutionary concept, I know. Professor Vexthul stared at me for a long moment. Then he began to make a noise that I could only describe as the intellectual equivalent of a dial-up modem having an aneurysm. After about 30 seconds of what I assumed was either deep thinking or a complete system reboot, Professor Vexthul pulled himself together. His compound eyes refocused on me with renewed determination, like a predator who'd just realized his prey might actually be inedible but was too proud to give up. Fine, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Clearly, your mind is too primitive to grasp the sophistication of proper intellectual discourse. Perhaps we should try a different approach. He gestured with all 4 arms, and suddenly I felt like someone was pressing against my brain with invisible fingers. The holographic displays around us began pulsing in rhythm with what I assumed was supposed to be some kind of telepathic assault. I am now employing direct mental pressure techniques, he announced. Prepare to have your consciousness overwhelmed by pure psychic force. I waited for something dramatic to happen. The pressing sensation felt kind of like when you have a stuffy nose, but less annoying. Huh, I said after a moment. That's it? Vexthul's mandibles stopped clicking entirely. You should be experiencing crushing mental anguish. I mean, I've got a slight headache, but I had that before we started. Do you have any aspirin, or whatever the galactic equivalent is? A strangled noise escaped from somewhere in the crowd. I was pretty sure it came from the 3-armed student, who was now openly weeping. This is impossible, Vexthul muttered, increasing the pressure. The holographic displays began spinning faster, creating patterns that should have induced immediate vertigo and existential dread. Your mind should be fragmenting under this level of psychic bombardment. Oh, that explains the swirly lights, I said, nodding. They're actually kind of pretty, reminds me of the screensaver I used to have. Professor Vexthul made a sound like a computer trying to divide by 0. Then he straightened up, his entire posture radiating barely contained academic rage. Very well, human. If you believe yourself capable of withstanding my mental assaults, then perhaps you would care to demonstrate your own intellectual prowess. Present me with your greatest challenge. And that's when I realized I was in trouble. Not because I couldn't think of a challenge, but because I had the perfect one, and some part of my brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea. I ignored that part of my brain. It never had any fun anyway. Okay, I said, settling back in my chair with the confidence of a man who was about to either triumph spectacularly or die in the most embarrassing way possible. Here's one for you. What gets wetter the more it dries? The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Professor Vexthul's head snapped back as if I'd slapped him. His compound eyes widened to what I assumed was their maximum diameter. The holographic displays flickered and died. What? He said slowly. Did you just ask me? What gets wetter the more it dries? I repeated helpfully. It's a riddle. You know those things? Where the answer is usually something clever and obvious once you think about it? I could practically see the gears grinding in his head. All four of his arms began moving in complex patterns, as if he was trying to solve advanced calculus in sign language. This is some form of multi-dimensional paradox, he muttered. The wetness coefficient cannot increase proportionally to the drying function unless we're dealing with temporal mechanics or quantum moisture dynamics. Or, I said gently, it's just a towel. The silence that followed was so profound that I was pretty sure I could hear the universe expanding. A towel? Vexthul repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, you know. You dry things with it so it gets wetter as it dries other stuff. Pretty simple when you think about it. Professor Vexpel stared at me with the expression of a being who just watched his entire understanding of reality collapse into a singularity of pure bewilderment. But there must be deeper meaning, hidden complexity, mathematical implications. Nope, I said cheerfully. Just a towel. Want to try another one? What has hands but cannot clap? And that's when I realized that Professor Vexthul's superior intellect was about to become his greatest weakness. Professor Vexthul's forearms had gone completely still, frozen in mid-gesture like a statue of academic confusion. His compound eyes were fixed on me with the intensity of someone trying to solve the universe's greatest mystery, which, in a way, I guessed he was. What has hands but cannot clap? He whispered, his voice carrying the weight of existential crisis. I could see his brain working overtime. Every few seconds, one of his arms would twitch as if he was about to gesture towards some complex mathematical solution, then stop as he realized he was thinking about it wrong. The holographic displays around us flickered weakly, like they were trying to compute something that didn't compute. Is it, he said slowly, a quantum mechanical representation of appendages existing in a state of perpetual non-collision? No. A philosophical metaphor for the futility of applause in a deterministic universe? Nope. A mathematical equation where hands represent variables that cannot achieve the intersection required for clapping? I was starting to feel a little bad for him. It was like watching someone try to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. It's a clock, I said gently. The noise that came from Professor Vexthul can only be described as the sound of a supercomputer trying to process the concept of simplicity, and failing catastrophically. His head tilted so far to one side I was worried it might fall off entirely. A clock, he repeated, in a voice that suggested he was questioning everything he'd ever believed about the nature of reality. Yeah, you know. Hour hand, minute hand. They're called hands, but they can't clap because they're, not actually hands. Several of the watching students had now progressed from quiet weeping to what appeared to be full-scale nervous breakdowns. The crystalline being was vibrating at frequencies that were making my teeth hurt again, and the sentient jelly had formed itself into what I could only describe as a shape of pure despair. But I wasn't done yet. Oh no. I had an entire arsenal of kindergarten-level intellectual warfare at my disposal, and I was just getting warmed up. Okay, here's another one, I said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone who was either about to save the day or destroy a galactic education system. Knock knock. What? Vexthul's voice cracked like a 13-year-old going through puberty. Knock knock. It's a joke format. You're supposed to say who's there. Professor Vexthul stared at me for a full 30 seconds. I could practically see him running through every database of cosmic knowledge he'd ever accessed, trying to find some reference point for what was happening to him. Who's there? He said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Interrupting cow W. Bow. The effect was immediate and devastating. Professor Vexthul actually jumped backward, all forearms flailing as if he'd been physically attacked. His compound eyes were now so wide I was worried they might pop out of his head entirely. What just happened? He stammered. It's the joke. The interrupting cow interrupts you before you can finish asking who it is. That's why it's funny. But there was no cow. No interruption protocol was established. The logical parameters of the interaction were violated without warning or consent. Yeah, that's the point. It's unexpected. That's what makes it funny. I could see him trying to process this concept. His mandibles were clicking so rapidly they sounded like a typewriter having a seizure. The three-armed student in the crowd had actually passed out and was being fanned by one of the 6 armed mathematicians. But humor should follow logical structures, Vexthul protested weakly. There should be setup, development, and payoff based on recognized patterns of expectation and subversion within established parameters. Or, I said, you could just have a cow go moo at the wrong time. And then I went in for the kill. Hey, Professor, why did the chicken cross the road? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs just before stars collapse into black holes. Professor Vexthol's entire body went rigid, his compound eyes fixed on me with the desperate intensity of a drowning man, grasping for a life preserver made of pure logic. Fine specifically, while he whispered, "To get to the other side." What happened next will probably be studied by xenopsychologists for generations. Professor Vextol, the galaxy's most feared intellectual predator, the being who had reduced the Crown Prince of Altera to tears with a single philosophical question, began to shake. It started as a small tremor in his hands, then spread to his arms, then his whole body. His mandibles were clicking so fast they were creating a high-pitched whine that made everyone in the room cover their various auditory organs. "But that's not a joke," he said, his voice rising in pitch with each word. That's just a statement of intent. The chicken crossed the road to get to the other side. That's not humor, that's just what happened. Where's the intellectual complexity? Where's the wordplay? Where's the subversion of expectation? "There isn't any," I said. "Sometimes the answer is just the obvious one." And that's when Professor Vextol completely lost it. What followed was the most spectacular academic meltdown in galactic history. Professor Vextol began pacing in rapid circles, all four arms gesticulating wildly as he muttered increasingly frantic calculations under his breath. His compound eyes darted back and forth like he was watching the universe's most confusing tennis match, and his mandibles were clicking out what sounded like Morse code for "do not compute." "There has to be more," he kept repeating, his voice getting higher and more strained with each repetition. "The chicken joke is a fundamental structure of humor across 17 different species. There has to be layers, hidden meanings, quantum entanglements of comedic possibility." I watched him spiral with a mixture of fascination and growing concern. This was like watching a supercomputer try to run on a calculator's operating system. "Maybe," I suggested gently. "Sometimes a joke is just a joke." "No!" he shrieked, causing half the watching students to dive for cover behind their desks. "Nothing is that simple. Reality doesn't work that way. Intelligence doesn't work that way." He stopped pacing suddenly and whirled to face me, his eyes blazing with desperate intensity. "You're playing some kind of metagame, aren't you? This is all part of some incredibly sophisticated psychological strategy. You're using apparent simplicity to mask layers of complexity so profound that even I cannot perceive them." I scratched my head. "Actually, no. I'm just a kindergarten teacher who thinks you're overthinking things." The words hit him like a physical blow. His entire body went slack, and for a moment I thought he might actually collapse. Instead, he staggered backward and slumped into his chair, all four arms hanging limply at his sides. "A kindergarten teacher," he repeated in a hollow voice. "Yeah. Back on Earth, I spend my days teaching 5-year-olds basic stuff. Colors, numbers, how to tie their shoes, why we don't eat the finger paint, simple things." "Simple things?" he echoed, staring off into the distance like he was seeing the universe for the first time. The watching crowd was completely silent now. Even the crystalline being had stopped vibrating. It was like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see if one of the galaxy's greatest minds was about to have a complete existential collapse or achieve some kind of enlightenment. "I've spent 3 centuries, Vextol said slowly, developing the most sophisticated methods of intellectual intimidation known to science. I've reduced Nobel laureates to gibbering wrecks with my philosophical paradoxes. I've made theoretical physicists question their own existence with my quantum logic puzzles." He looked up at me with something that might have been wonder or might have been horror. It was hard to tell with compound eyes. "And you defeated me with nursery rhymes and farm animals." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of mean," I said. "I wasn't trying to defeat you, I was just answering your questions." "Just answering my questions," he repeated. Then, to my complete shock, he started laughing. Not the maniacal laughter of someone having a breakdown, but genuine, hearty laughter that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his thorax. "Do you know what you've done, human?" he asked between chuckles. "Probably something I shouldn't have. You've reminded me that intelligence isn't always about complexity. Sometimes the most profound insights come from the simplest observations. Sometimes the best solution is the obvious one. Sometimes a chicken really does just want to get to the other side of the road." He stood up slowly, straightening his academic robes with new dignity. When he looked at me again, there was something different in his compound eyes. Respect, maybe, or possibly just relief that his brain hadn't actually melted. "I concede defeat," he announced to the room. The human has demonstrated a form of strategic thinking that I was completely unprepared for. The crowd erupted, not in celebration exactly, but in the kind of amazed murmur that happens when people witness something they never thought possible. The three-armed student had regained consciousness and was staring at me like I'd just performed actual magic. The sentient jelly had reformed itself into what looked like a shape of profound respect. Strategic thinking, I asked. I was just being myself. Exactly, Vextool said, nodding sagely. You deployed what I can only call weaponized simplicity. When faced with complexity, you responded with clarity. When challenged with sophistication, you countered with practicality. It's brilliant in its directness. One of the six-armed students raised a hand. Professor, are you saying that sometimes the best way to win an intellectual battle is to not fight it on intellectual terms? I'm saying, Vexhol replied, that there are many forms of intelligence, and sometimes the wisest approach is to choose not to overcomplicate things. He turned back to me with what I was pretty sure was admiration. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? I grinned. Well, you spend enough time with 5-year-olds, you learn that the best way to handle someone who's showing off is to just let them exhaust themselves. Kids do the same thing. They'll try to impress you with big words or complicated stories, and usually the best response is just to smile and ask simple questions until they realize they're making things harder than they need to be. So this entire time, you were treating me like a child having a tantrum. Kind of, yeah, no offense. Professor Vexthul considered this for a moment, then threw back his triangular head and laughed again. None taken. In fact, I think I needed someone to treat me like a child having a tantrum. I'd forgotten what it was like to approach problems with genuine curiosity instead of academic arrogance. He gestured to the assembled students. Class, you have just witnessed a master class in practical intelligence. Sometimes the most sophisticated strategy is to have no strategy at all. Sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the surface level, and sometimes the best way to solve a complex problem is to remember that not all problems are actually complex. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they'd witnessed, Professor Vexthul approached me one last time. Thank you, he said simply. I haven't learned something genuinely new in decades. You've reminded me that there's always more to discover, even in the simplest places. Hey, no problem, that's what teachers are for, right? And as I walked out of that crystal cathedral of higher learning, surrounded by beings whose IQs were measured in scientific notation, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best education happens when you remember that learning doesn't have to be complicated to be profound. After all, any 5-year-old could have told you that.